Yugoslavia's Marshal Tito, a remarkable 84 years young, seemingly almost as decisive and energetic today as he's been at any time in the 3 decades he's led his country. Tito is not only an amazingly active man, he's an outstandingly busy statesman. His schedule over the past year has been full enough to tax many a politician half his age. Yet Tito shows no sign of slackening his grip on the country's helm. Recently, he's played host to a succession of foreign leaders, Egypt's President Sadat among them. Visits abroad have also been part of Tito's continuingly strenuous life. He's just returned from Greece, and this year he's already been to Mexico, Panama, Venezuela, Portugal and Sweden, while talks in Turkey are also coming up. All this at an age when most men would be content to put up their feet and watch the world go by. But Tito's not at all like most men. Life started here for the Yugoslav leader. Born in Kumrovec in Croatia, 30 miles from Zagreb in 1892. He's remembered by statues and a museum in the cottage where he spent his earliest years. He was the 7th of 15 children of poor parents. 8 of his brothers and sisters died in childhood, though he and the rest of the family have proved exceptionally long-lived. When he left home, it was to be an apprentice locksmith, later a mechanic and driver, then an agent for the Communist Party. But it was as a military leader that Tito first became dear to Yugoslavs. During the Second World War, he proved brilliant at organizing a guerrilla campaign as commander of one of 2 Yugoslav resistance groups. In April 1941, Yugoslavia was invaded by the German army, and just 11 days later, the government capitulated. But that wasn't the end of the fight for many Yugoslavs. 2 resistance groups sprang up, the Chetniks, who were composed of former army officers and backed by the Western Allies, and the partisans, communists led by a professional revolutionary, Josip Broz, who was later to take the name Tito. From a hideout in the mountains, he was able to harass the enemy and keep at bay the Chetniks, who'd become more interested in fighting him than the Germans. At this point, the Allies switched all their support to Tito's army. There was dreadful suffering for the ill-equipped partisans, who sometimes lived only on grass and bark in sub-zero conditions, moving from one battle to the next. Only a quarter of Tito's men survived the war, but their hardships had been his, and they loved him for sharing them. The Russian army helped Tito sweep the Nazis from Belgrade, and with liberation, Tito emerged triumphant as the national leader, more popular by far than the monarchist government in exile. Yugoslavs greeted the end of their war with jubilation, though almost 2 million of them had died, about 10% of the population. In financial terms, too, it had been costly. $50 billion would be needed to make good the devastation wrought by Hitler's dive bombers and shells. When work began to rebuild battered Belgrade, it was Tito, heading the first post-war government, who directed the task. The organization of the country's economy proceeded on Marxist lines. The state-owned sector grew, and a Russian plan for 5 years of aid was signed. To outsiders, it looked as though Tito would lead Yugoslavia into the Russian camp. But Tito wasn't prepared to accept instructions from Moscow. He had in mind his own brand of communism, Yugoslav communism, and he purged his party of pro-Russian elements. In 1948, as the Soviets realized Tito would follow his own course, they expelled Yugoslavia from the organization of European communist parties. Tito turned to the United States, accepting military and economic aid, and forged trading links with the West. Tito's Yugoslav communism flourished as industry found its feet again. But Yugoslavia was a continual source of anguish to the Soviet Union. Communist, like the other satellites, yet independent of Moscow, a situation intolerable to the Stalinists of the day who demanded conformity. Realizing his vulnerability, Tito walked a tightrope, maintaining his right to run Yugoslavia while never openly declaring himself an enemy of the Soviets. In reply, the Soviet bloc constantly attacked policies until 1955, when a temporary rapprochement came. With the Stalin era past, Mr. Khrushchev and Marshal Bulganin chose the spring to visit Yugoslavia. Khrushchev proffered the hand of friendship. Two offers were made: a declaration to normalize relations between the two countries and an invitation for Tito to visit the USSR. Soon the pendulum of relations was to swing up and the party links were remade. Whenever Mr. Khrushchev appeared in Yugoslavia in public, there was every reason to believe that Moscow and Belgrade had buried the hatchet. Superficially, there was plenty of warmth shown. But Moscow was in fact distressed at the sympathy Tito was showing for another satellite, Hungary, whose ambitions were similar to Tito's own. It wasn't long before the Russians were actually blaming Tito for the Hungarian uprising. And when he criticized Russia's handling of the rebellion, the rift opened afresh. In 1959, President Tito visited India to confer with another neutralist, Nehru. For India, like Yugoslavia, was a country keen to steer a middle course, clear of the great power blocs. The policy of non-alignment was one he perfected with the Egyptian leader Nasser, who also became a close personal friend. It was such a meeting between the two leaders in 1961 that resulted in the first Belgrade Conference of non-aligned nations. He'd cultivated relations with the heads of small nations in Asia and South America, and the conference was a success. Tito referred in his opening speech to the urgent need for non-aligned countries to make the great powers realize that the fate of the world could not rest in their hands alone. He said they should use their influence to help bring about peaceful solutions to international problems. It was to be the first of many such declarations. With his country on a far more stable footing, and with his own status secure as president for life, Tito occasionally indulged his taste for luxury and high living. Now an accomplished statesman, the president was able to greatly expand Yugoslavia's foreign relations. But the Russian problem persisted, even when the Soviet Union changed its leader and Leonid Brezhnev tried to woo Yugoslavia into the Russian fold. It seemed as though the attempt might bear some fruit as far as practical cooperation was concerned. But once again, détente was destined for defeat by affairs outside Yugoslavia. Tito was making no secret of his support for Czechoslovakia's stand for a similar type of communism to his own. Czech leader Alexander Dubček was calling it communism with a human face. So, once more, relations with Russia soured, though Tito received a tremendous welcome when he visited Czechoslovakia. In fact, one of the greatest ever given by Prague to a visiting head of state. A communiqué on talks there boldly stated that both countries had exchanged information on the problems of building socialism and that they attached importance to working together in the struggle for peace. Tito's objections didn't prevent Russia from invading Czechoslovakia, but he was praised at home for his courageous stand. He told the people of Belgrade, "We have paid for our sovereignty with our blood. If necessary, we shall retain it with our blood." The course of economic development under Tito has been almost as checkered as political relations with Moscow. In the space of a generation, Industrialization has transformed what used to be a traditional and backward peasant society. Tito's stand against Russia ensured that Yugoslavia remained outside Comecon, the Soviet-sponsored economic system in Eastern Europe. And even in today's more relaxed atmosphere, Yugoslavia is still only an associate member of the organization. Growing trade links with the West have created much more of a consumer society in Yugoslavia than exists in other communist countries, and the signs of it are evident in the shop windows of every large town. Such prosperity as the country enjoys is the result of mixing communist orthodoxy with some of the practices of Western capitalism, a pragmatic arrangement typical of Tito's Yugoslavia. Industry is almost entirely state-owned. In law, private enterprises are not allowed to employ more than 5 people. In the 1950s and 60s, government plans gave priority to manufacturing industry, and funds were poured into new factories making electronic equipment, artificial fibers, and other light industrial products. But though the factories themselves are state-owned, they are not state-managed. For the Yugoslavs discovered early in their industrial development that the usual communist system of centralized planning was often a handicap to economic growth. So the running of the concerns was handed over to the workers themselves, organized in local councils and management boards. Over the years, the self-management system has been extended to hospitals, newspapers, universities, in fact to every institution employing a group of workers. It's now become a guiding principle of the state and is applied to political organization too, at the local level. The doctrine of self-management hasn't of itself ensured success. It's not been a magic formula that's dissolved economic realities, and the problems facing the workers' councils have been as difficult to solve as those which previously confronted the state planners. Although annual economic growth is running at 10%, inflation last year was nearly 30%. But the mushrooming housing blocks in the suburbs of Belgrade show that living standards have improved substantially in the last 20 years. Nikola Pantelic is 43 years old and lives with his wife and 2 daughters in a 2-roomed apartment. He's worked for 27 years in a pharmaceutical factory, and his employers provide the living accommodation. His wife, Radoshka, also works for the same firm, and between them, they earn about 7,500 dinars a month, equal to just over $400 US. It's not a bad salary by Yugoslav standards, but it allows them few luxuries. Any Yugoslav wanting to earn really big money usually ends up working abroad in the richer economies of Western Europe. Over the years, hundreds of thousands have crossed the frontier, taking advantage of the complete freedom of travel denied to most citizens in other communist countries. And with the abolition of entry visas nearly 10 years ago, there's been a flood of traffic in the other direction too. Millions of foreign tourists a year bring not only their money to Yugoslavia, but also a lifestyle that many Yugoslavs admire and would like to emulate. To boost the tourist business, the government has allowed private foreign capital to invest in national enterprises, a heretical revision of orthodox communist thinking. Contacts with the West have been strengthened on the political front too. West Germany, which broke off relations in 1957 when Tito recognized East Germany, re-established diplomatic links in 1968 and has since become an important trading partner. Even in the very citadels of anti-communism, President Tito has been treated as a welcome guest. In 1971, he and his wife were cordially received by Pope Paul in the Vatican. The Pope clearly welcomed the opportunity to open up a channel of communication with a communist leader, a third of whose people are Catholics. Nearer to home, President Tito has also been mending fences with a traditional enemy, Greece. Last month, he and Greek Premier Konstantin Karamanlis met in Athens, and the Yugoslav leader offered to mediate in Greece's dispute with Turkey over Cyprus. Mr. Karamanlis has also long campaigned for closer cooperation among Balkan countries, and the Yugoslav president supported a suggestion for a Balkan conference in the near future. For when it comes to understanding the complexities and tensions of Balkan life, there's no one to match President Tito. Yugoslavia itself is a microcosm of the whole Balkan region. Despite its 900-kilometer coastline, it's surrounded by no fewer than 7 countries. It's therefore at the very center of a region that's always been a source of conflict in European history. The country is divided into 6 federated republics, which between them account for 5 races, 3 languages and 3 religions. There's also a difference in wealth between the 3 northern republics of Slovenia, Croatia and Serbia, where most of the industry is, and the 3 southern republics, which are largely undeveloped. The whole of Yugoslavia's political development has been conditioned by the need to balance all these disparate elements to form a viable nation. It's not been an easy task, as Yugoslavia's record of 4 constitutions since the war shows only too clearly. In all of them, the chief problem has been how to distribute power between the central government and the regions. The latest constitution was adopted in January 1974. It established 2 federal chambers, where previously there'd been 5. Delegates to the chamber would be elected by self-managing organizations and not directly by the people. And the collective presidency, the supreme executive institution, was reduced from 23 members to 9. At its first session, the new assembly elected Marshal Tito president of the Federal Republic for an indefinite period. On the president's retirement or death, his powers revert to a presidential council, which will elect a chairman for a year, after which the office rotates annually among the federated republics. But when that day comes, as it inevitably will, who will succeed Tito? It's not an easy question to answer. It could be Mr. Stani Dolenc, head of the Communist Party's executive committee, or Vladimir Bakaric, the silver-haired vice president from Croatia. But whoever takes over, can Yugoslavia hold together without Tito? Deputy Foreign Minister Lazar Mojave.
It will stay strongly on the same course of its development just because of the historic role played by President Tito, just because in all these 32 years, we are just on the eve of our 32nd anniversary of the foundation of Yugoslav Federation in 1943, just because President Tito made such a great contribution with his leadership to the foundations of our society, and these foundations are strong for the future too.
But when the unifying force of President Tito is no longer there, can Yugoslavia stay together?
But unifying force of the Tito is only a symbol of the unifying force of the movement which is created during our revolutionary process. And this unifying force is so great because just all our political movement, the League of the Communists of Yugoslavia, the Socialist Alliance of the Working People of Yugoslavia, will all millions of its members are strongly unified in its desire to build our society on the same foundations.
Even without President Tito?
Even without him, because he led the foundations for our revolutionary process in such a historic way that this will stay for a long, long period as a source of enthusiasm for future generations of Yugoslavia.
Despite such official optimism, there are many Yugoslavs who remain anxious about the future and especially about the way the Russians might behave when Tito's gone. The Soviet embassy is one of the busiest buildings in Belgrade, and some Yugoslavs believe that much of the work here concerns methods of bringing Yugoslavia back into the Soviet fold, either by persuasion or force. If the Russians did attempt a Czech-style invasion, there's little doubt the Yugoslavs would fight. And the fact that defense spending last year was up 50% on the year before shows the government is aware of the possibility. After Czechoslovakia in 1968, a new program of total national defense was organized, involving territorial armies of citizen soldiers helping regular troops. The Yugoslav army would be no match for the Russians in set-piece battles, but guerrilla warfare could probably be carried on indefinitely in Yugoslavia's rugged terrain. But for Mr. Mojave, the very idea of a Russian invasion belongs to the realm of fantasy.
I think this question is also one of the dramatizing questions about Yugoslavia, which from time to time are asked in some journalistic circles in the West, because they always spread some speculations about the future of Yugoslavia. The relations between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union are based on the principles of the full recognition of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and non-interference in internal affairs of each other's, and on the recognition of the right of Yugoslavia to make its own choice in its internal development. These basic principles are led in the so-called Belgrade Declaration of 1955, Moscow Declaration of 1956, and in these 20 years we have already an experience in fulfilling this basis of the relationship between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. That is why I don't believe, because all these relations experienced already 20 years of development, I don't see any interest of Soviet Union to change the basis of this relationship. That is why I'm sure that the question of some intervention, or what you say, is only a very hypothetical question which will never occur in the relations between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. And it is only part of dramatizing the present situation in this part of the world.
They wanted that in Hungary and Czechoslovakia.
But the relations with Hungary and Czechoslovakia are based on a different principles. They are both belonging to the Warsaw Pact. The history of the relations between Soviet Union and, let us say, Hungary and Czechoslovakia are totally different than the relations with Yugoslavia.
For over 30 years, Josip Broz Tito has been the hero of his people, a fearless commander against the Nazis, a skillful politician against the Russians, now almost a national legend. With his third wife, Jovanka, who's 30 years younger than he is, he spends much of his leisure time on his private island of Brioni. At times, Jovanka still acts as a personal secretary, while Tito indulges his hobby for mechanics, which he learned as a youth. To charges that he enjoys more of the good life than is proper for a communist leader, he replies bluntly that he's earned it. He also admits his jails house political prisoners, but would argue that the unity and security of the state places limits on the exercise of individual freedoms. Ruthlessness has been part of his life, practiced against him as much as by him. But it's just this ruthless quality, this iron determination, that's ensured both his own and his country's survival.